Hey everyone, this is Nick, your NIRO Knowledge podcast host. Today I am coming to you, obviously, video for those of you who are watching it and as the podcast itself. So a couple of ways now as I start to transition into both audio and visual mediums to have and host this podcast as we continue to grow forward and look towards 2021. There was a topic of conversation I kind of wanted to bring about something higher level, right? Not our technical aspect of the job and what it is that we do and how we do it and the tools we use. But a little bit more, I guess, back to basics, back to the principles of policing even. So today and probably next week as well, before the year ends, I think I want to kind of get this conversation rolling. We've had some good Twitter conversations as of late. Asked what it was that people wanted to see for training and would like to get trained on. So that has been a good topic of conversation. And this time I kind of want to throw it out there for everybody and talk about the principles of policing and how analysts can kind of get involved in that and hopefully be somewhat of the influencers to get the change to happen. We have our hands, our fingers on the pulse, right? In some form, we know what's going on with our agencies, within our community, within our jurisdictions. And we also see, obviously, with the news, what's going on here in America, and I'm sure in other countries, some of the issues that may be arising, whether it's an increase in crime rate in certain ways, the pandemic that may have had some effect of what's going on. But again, it kind of comes back down to basics. What really us and basics and principles. What are we, not only as analysts, but within the policing industry, looking to do, looking to change? What is our role? What is the job that is supposed to be performed? And so I kind of want to get to that today, and I'm going to try and do something really fancy and cool, and hopefully it works in the editing phase of this all if you're watching it visually, and hopefully it does. So let's see if it works. I gotta get my hands right. Hold on.
NIRO Knowledge, one off.
All right, well, so if that editing worked, what you all saw was the intro that came across and the nice title card of NIRO Knowledge, the logo itself. So to dig into this, the reason I'm having this conversation, I've been thinking a lot lately about what went on this year in 2020, what we saw in the industry of policing and law enforcement, and some of the conversations that I've luckily had with the NIRO Knowledge podcast and shared with the rest of the world here and watching the growth that takes place. So I think we really need to figure out where we want to go, at least here in the States. And I know there's some countries that seem to have a pretty good handle on what they're doing, what they're looking towards in order to put us back on track, right? So here in the States, we've had what seems to be an issue with kind of an us versus them mentality. And I think it stemmed back probably a good couple decades ago with the 90s, 80s into the 90s, where more patrol officers and the vehicles themselves and nobody really having much in terms of community relations, and some of the news media turning towards some of these crimes that were happening. We had channels that started coming out like Court TV, and this conversation of what not just the law enforcement field, but criminal justice in general. But to focus on law enforcement in of itself, there's a lot of bad taste that happened with some of the news, because obviously, as we're well aware, news is to sell advertising, so the sensationalism happens. But with that, let's go back to what the kind of the founder of policing really pushed for in terms of policing principles, and that was Sir Robert Peel back in England, in the UK, almost 200 years ago. 1829 is when these principles came out, right? By Sir Robert Peel, and thankfully some people still hold on to them and remember these principles, because they really are speaking to the cooperation between police and law enforcement and the public. and it's a service that needs to happen there and take place. And I know a lot of law enforcement and police are that's what they're trying to do, is help serve the public. It's a good calling. The unfortunate part is there's a lot of bad flavoring that has taken place within the news media in this time. And unfortunately, as people, we just sometimes tend to broad stroke. So if you have a bad dealing with somebody in some aspect of life that has some different appearance, whether it is a uniform or a color or what is it, the rider, the patch basically on the back of somebody's leather coat from a motorcycle gang. There's all kinds of different things that kind of taint our nature sometimes. And that has happened obviously in law enforcement as well. But the question is, how do we get back to being a cohesive group? And so one of the principles, like the number one for policing, and I'm reading this right from the internet, right here, right now, from lawenforcementactionpartnership.org. So thank you for putting these out. To prevent, so Sir Robert Peel's number one of his 9 policing principles, to prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression by military force and severity of legal punishment. So it's to prevent even crime and disorder. This is number one, prevention. Prevention is number one. And to go along with it all the way down to number 9 is to recognize always that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder and not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with them, right? So it's as if this sort of big brother force, right, that is the police force in some form, is there not to lay punishment, not to be oppressive in any form between these two principles, right? It is to actually have the absence of crime and disorder. And us as analysts, that's really kind of our goal as well. The reason we dig into the data, the reason we come up with strategies, watch trends and patterns and everything else that comes in data entry that goes into the system, and fingers crossed that you have good, clean, solid data, is to knock those numbers down. And the conversation I had with Dr. Cynthia Lum was reinventing American policing. And one of the things talked about was we need better measurements in terms of showing how that takes place. Because what we're doing now is punitive, right? So even, again, back to number 1, to prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression by military force and severity of legal punishment. And I'm sure this is taught a little differently, but as I read this, legal punishment is you get pulled over, here's your ticket, right? You do something wrong, you get arrested. But there are ways for us to finagle around, and some of the evidence-based policing research that has been done was, again, showing that guardianship roles and actions end up doing better to curb and prevent the crime and disorder, to reduce those problems and issues by doing the guardianship roles as opposed to the enforcement practices. So just 2 of those 9 principles alone play into our aspect and our role as crime analysts to put out the information, but to also put forth those strategies in order to reduce the crime, in order to help prevent the disorder by making sure that we take the information and deal with it accordingly. It's not something they had 200 years ago. But it definitely plays to exactly what our roles are and how we can help move the criminal justice industry, obviously more specifically the police and law enforcement, into a better working practice to work with the public as opposed to against the public in some form to get that done. So that's the conversation I want to start here. What are your thoughts? There's a ton of great information in these 9 policing principles that Sir Robert Peel had put forward. I'll put the link on the one that I'm reading here anyway to take a look at. But that's that's really what it is. The whole conversation as you read through this is always talking about the public. And so the police and the public were always supposed to be one unit, right? There's powers given to the police in order to assist the public, but in cooperation, the public has to, fulfill their role as well to assist the police. So what is that for everybody? What do you feel is good? What do you believe should be some of the next steps to get us as crime analysts, to get our agencies to move forward, to work more cohesively with the public? And if you're an analyst in an agency that does that already, what do you do? Because there's a lot of great community programs and community policing that can be done to get that started. Obviously, another great aspect is kind of changing the way we look at crimes and laws, crimes in general, because even Dr. Lawrence Sherman, he has his crime harm index. And that's a great way of really looking at what is it that we're really attempting to help, to look at, to curb and prevent the crime and disorder, right? What are we doing? What should we be looking towards and forwards, in looking forward to 2021? How are we going to start shifting what's happening? Because all these knee-jerk reactions to some of the things that have taken place aren't really always the best step, right? So we need to go for not just the Band-Aid, but how do we cure the problem and get our information out to the public? How do we work with the public and get our agencies back to being a part of the public and working cohesively? Again, I know that's not everybody's issue. Some agencies, some communities have great relationships with their police departments. And I'm sure that's probably a good vast majority. But obviously there are people that struggle with that. So opened up here on the website, NIROCA.com. Twitter, follow NIRO Knowledge. LinkedIn. So there's a whole bunch of options. But have the conversation. Let's find out what's going on, what's happening. I think I'll be posting this on YouTube from now on too, so that'll be up there. With that, Friday, I also have another free Power BI webinar coming up. So sign up for that at the NIROCA.com. Should be a little bit towards the end of that homepage. You can sign up for free for that webinar. That'll be about using a master calendar within Power BI and how that relationship works for all your visualizations. And keep looking up and forward. I got some guests coming up. If you haven't seen already, Dr. Laura Huey has signed on once again. So we will be having her come in and tell us what's new, what's going on after this whole year of 2020, starting off strong and then turning pandemic, right? And some of her changes that she's got and other bits of information. So that's what we got going on. I hope you all had a great holiday for those of you in the States for the Thanksgiving. And we got more holidays coming up. So we will see you all very soon. Thanks. Another great episode of NIRO Knowledge. Thank you for listening to the podcast. And remember to share, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite service. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at nick@niroca.com. It is nick@niroca.com.